Professor John Haught in his presentation entitled Evolution and Faith. What's the problem? That's the right intonation. To prepare for this task, I scanned the internet for videos to catch up on the latest in internet atheism and the well-reasoned responses of the apologists. I must admit, the experience left me somewhat disenchanted. I discovered the Habermases and the Craigs, the Dawkinses and the Hitchenses. It all seemed to go on, and where to? I longed for a new Montaigne to click the reset button. I returned to his famous skeptical defense of orthodoxy, summed up in his ever-inspiring conclusion, what do I know? Intonation uncertain. But the title of Professor Haught's presentation sounds a little more optimistic, I guess, and somehow put me in mind of Newman and his famous statement, 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt. Perhaps my disenchantment with the online discussion and its 10,000 difficulties is that it does not seem to touch on the substance of faith and doubt. I speak as one smitten by faith, yet I would also like to be reasonable. Now, the Catholic Catechism tells us there can never be any real discrepancy between faith and reason, that faith seeks understanding, and a believer desires to know better the one in whom he has put his faith. And perhaps most interestingly, it says, faith is certain, more certain than all human knowledge. So, what is the problem? Well, for one thing, as Dr. Haught's writings imply, a little certainty can be a dangerous thing. Our internet voices often admit this, though typically it's about their opponents. But personally, I have often been certain, later to discover that it was with a misguided certainty. In my own faith, quite honestly and repentantly, I have had moments when I found I had to dispense with a false God or an inadequate representation of God. Is the intellectual struggle to understand evolution such a moment? But with Dr. Haught's theology, I am also reminded of the modesty of Newman's kindly light, which leads us amid the encircling gloom. The slender straws I hold on to in trying to understand God. They do not provide the stuff of a strident dogmatism, and John Haught is not at all strident. His modest orthodoxy, it seems to me, is not the brandishing of truth, but a sincere search for it. Chesterton, we may recall, does not equate orthodoxy with certainty, but rather with sanity. So, where does Dr. Haught's sanity lead us? A steady defender of the scientific commitment to evolution, he holds fast to the claim that Christian theology is in fact invigorated by scientific research. He leads us away from a reductive or scientistic rationalism and toward a more open rationality that he calls multi-layered. He leads us away from flippant atheisms and from fideistic creationisms and toward a reflective theism. Dr. Haught has pointed us somewhat less modestly in the direction of the evolutionary theology of Teilhard de Chardin, who sees God as the omega point towards which the, you have to raise your hand when you say that, towards which the evolving universe is directed, a universe ever ascending in consciousness. This reference is significant to me since my high school yearbook quotation from Teilhard, yes, my high school yearbook quotation from Portsmouth Abbey School. here it is. I can't believe I get the chance to reiterate. It is better to be more conscious than less conscious. This principle, I believe, is the absolute condition of the world's existence. I sometimes worry that my classmates read into that quotation some sort of drug reference. Psychedelic but no, this was a sincere and enthusiastic embrace of the vision of theology. I think I was more certain of it then than I am now, but as I have suggested, a little less certainty is not necessarily a bad thing. And perhaps Dr. Haught will help me rediscover the truth in it. So, it is my privilege to introduce to you the eminently sane John Haught, author of numerous articles and books, former head of theology at Georgetown for many years, currently senior fellow at the Woodstock Theological Center, and famously witness for the defense of science at the Dover Evolution trial, or perhaps we can call it Inherit the Rewind. I look forward to his discussion, after which we perhaps will not say problem solved, though I am confident that we will be able to say problem clarified. In any case, I now ask Dr. Haught, evolution and faith, what is the problem?
Before Dr. Haught begins, I hear from our videographer there are still cell phones on. I promise you everything tonight is going to be recorded and posted to our website. Please turn them off so we get the best possible audio sound you can if you have the devices on. Thank you. Dr. Haught?
Thank you, Doctor, for that very nice framing of the question. I'm very grateful to be here. I want to thank all those who thought that I could add something to this wonderful program on ancient faith and modern science. And I also want to thank all of you for being here as well. Now, I was just introduced as a theologian, so with apologies to those who have heard me before on this, I want to define for you what a theologian is. A theologian is someone who doesn't make much money, but at least knows a lot. And I should add that this is for the sake of my good friend Michael Roos, that for many years I tried very hard to be a philosopher instead. But cheerfulness kept breaking me. So I had to become a theologian. Now, all of you know that our country, at least half, maybe more of the people in our country have severe problems digesting Darwin's evolutionary ideas. So I thought I would talk about what's at stake for these people. And I think to start with, just to get right to the point, for many of them, what's at stake in this whole discussion is the existence of a creator. If it's natural selection, the mechanism of natural selection, that is the cause of life's diversity and design, what place then is there for a creator? Many of them ask. And for many people, what's at issue is the goodness of creation. If life came about in the ragged way that the Darwinian recipe says it did, what are we to think of God? What are we to think of divine care, divine providence, divine wisdom? For many people, what's at issue is the question of human identity. If there are no sharp breaks any longer between humans and non-human species, well, who are we? Very, very big question that we ask here. For Christians, what is the meaning of Christ, if evolution is true? What is the scope of redemption? What do we do with original sin? That's been the big question for lots of people. But in general, the biggest question underlying all of these is, for a lot of people, after Darwin, how is it possible, if at all, to make sense of the notion of divine providence? Providence, from the word provide, refers to God's care for creation. And what are we to think of the venerable teaching about the infinite wisdom of God if life has the shape that evolutionary biology says it does? Ancient faith, the cozier pre-evolutionary universe, didn't have this problem. The universe was organized hierarchically until very recently, in terms of a ladder of levels, a great chain of being, scala naturae, where matter is at the bottom, then plants, then animals, then humans, then perhaps angelic spheres, then the divine. And this was the lattice around which divine spirituality wove itself for so many centuries. And I would say that the religious sensibilities of most of us here are still deeply shaped by this classic vertical hierarchical view of the universe. Our ethical and religious sensibilities are deeply tied to this vertical view of things. In this view, nature has value, finite value, because it reflects an eternal wisdom, and each level does this in its own way. Species were thought of until recently as created, especially pretty much as they are in the beginning and remaining fixed throughout this small number of years that have elapsed since the creation. And the discontinuity of levels allowed us humans, especially, to think that we are perhaps cared for in a very special way by divine providence. This is ancient faith, roughly speaking. Let's now look at modern science, and especially its fascinating picture of the drama of life and the universe, the 13.7 billion year universe that Jim mentioned earlier in his talk. Just to give some sense of the scale of this roughly 14 billion year old universe, imagine that you have on your bookshelf 30 big books, and each of these books is 450 pages long, and each page stands for 1 million years in the story. The Big Bang would take place on page 1 of volume 1, but you'll notice that the first two shelves and part of the third consist of essentially lifeless and mindless material stuff and processes. Life was not in a big hurry to come into this universe. The Earth spins out around the Sun in volume 21. A billion or so years later, the first small sparks of life begin to flame up rather unenthusiastically. And life remains at a relatively simple status, single cells for the most part, until you get almost to the end of volume 29, 500 to 600 million years ago, when the famous Cambrian explosion takes place. And then the complexification of life accelerates. Still, dinosaurs don't come in until after the middle of volume 30, and they go extinct on page 385. And when do we come in? Modern, anatomically modern humans, descendants of Cro-Magnon, somewhere in the last 10th or maybe the last 5th of the very last page of the very last volume. This is the first time that intelligence, our ethical aspirations, and our ancient faith traditions enter into the terrestrial scene. So if you're a thoughtful person, you can't help, and especially if you're theologically interested in Buddha, you can't help asking, what is going on here? What is this all about? If you're a skeptic, such as Bertrand Russell, you might ask, if the universe, if the whole point of this process was to produce intelligence, then why did it take so long to produce so little? But for our purposes, we want to concentrate on what happens in the last set of volumes here, in this 30-volume set. The evolutionary recipe, which takes over right after the origin of life. To simplify it, we may say it consists of 3 ingredients: lots of accidents, plus the impersonal mechanism of natural selection, plus lots and lots of time. It's relatively simple idea in evolution. Accident in the origin of life, accidents in the variations, or what today we call genetic mutations, which provide the raw material for evolution. It can be random, dominated by chance. And accidents in natural history, such as the asteroid that impacted the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago, wiping out the dinosaurs, but opening up niches for the development of mammals and eventually primates and eventually ourselves. So much in life work today seems to depend on an accident. How do you reconcile that with divine intelligence, with divine providence? Because you know, a lot of people simply can't do this. Not just religious people, but a lot of scientists too. So we have a big standoff, we have a big conflict around this idea of chance and randomness. So we'll come back and talk about that later on. Then there's the impersonal law, as it's called, of natural selection, which selects only those organisms which happen to be adaptive, reproductively successful, and leaves in the dust all the rest. Is this fair? How do we reconcile this with divine creativity, divine providence? A lot of people simply can't. And then there's the colossal amount of time that it's taken to produce what evolutionary outcomes we have. Why, if there's an intelligent, providential, caring, wise being, why would it take so long to bring about life and eventually mind, consciousness? Isn't that a waste, all this time? At least a lot of people think it is. So it's very difficult for lots of people, and I say not just religious people, but scientists too, to reconcile this picture of life with inherited ideas of God. So what do we do with providence? What do we do with the notion of divine wisdom? As you know, there are other theories as to why the dinosaurs are extinct. This is one of them. Well, a lot of people have the problem of how to reconcile the Darwinian picture of human origins with classical theological understanding of human existence and human creation and our specialness in the scheme of things. Our ancestors lived first in the swamps and then later in holes in the ground and then later swamped in trees. How do you map that on to any classic theological picture of human creation? It'd be interesting if this were a class to stop now and ask how you do this, or do you do it at all? A lot of people simply can't. And so there's a big problem with human evolution. Kim Miller will talk more about this tomorrow. Anyway, even independently of Darwin, people have always been squeamish about the way in which life feeds upon life. But Darwin was extremely sensitive to this fact of life. And he wrote to a friend of his, Joseph Hooker, what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering low, and horribly cruel works of nature. And he referred to what he called the dreadful but quiet war of organic beings that's going on in peaceful woods and smiling fields. Underneath that romantic veneer, he saw a whole history of violence and bloodshed, which we hadn't really reflected on too much before Darwin. T.H. Huxley, when he looked at Darwin's portrait of life, asked, what kind of example is life setting for us? And he assumed, as many people do today, that never again can we look to nature to find examples or instruction as to how we humans should behave ourselves. George Williams, one of the grand figures of contemporary biology, wrote somewhat famously that nature is a wicked old witch because of the wild way in which evolution has brought about life, including human life, on our planet. My favorite example of this wildness is the life cycle of the sheep liver fluid. Now, I know you're all already familiar with this. Allow me to review it for you. Starting around 4 o'clock on this circle, this cycle of life, there's a parasite that lives near our ponds, and it goes into the pond and gets inside a water snail and starts eating the snail away from the inside. It reproduces asexually, and the youngsters swim to the edge of the pond and they climb up blades of grass and form little cyst-like formations on the grass, so that when a cow or a sheep comes along and eats the grass, the stomach juices digest the cyst and more worms crawl out. They make their way into the liver and the bile ducts, causing enormous discomfort to the poor animal. And then they pass on in feces, and the cycle begins or re-begins. It goes over and over and over again. from millennium after millennium. Now again, if you're a thoughtful person, you can't help asking, what is going on here? Well, Sir Charles Sherrington, as you can see from his picture, is not very happy about this. And it's from Sir Charles that I got this fascinating example. As far as he's concerned, and he writes this in his different lectures, Man on His Nature, he says it seems to him, this is a story of securing existence to a worm at cost of lives superior to it in the scale of life as humanly reckoned. And he goes on to say that it seems to him that life's prize is given to the aggressive and inferior forms of life. And this, he says, is only one of many other examples that naturalists could give us. If you ask Sir Richard Dawkins, probably the best known name in evolutionary thought today, a man who never lets an opportunity pass, to tell you that the best framework for understanding evolution is atheism. It's not alone there. But he said it's not hard to understand what's going on here at all. It's simply a matter of genes trying to get into subsequent generations. So long as DNA, segments of genes, is passed on, it does not matter who or what gets hurt in the process. Genes, he says, don't care about suffering because they don't care about anything. And he draws this famous philosophical conclusion: the universe we observe, meaning the Darwinian universe, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Certainly no divine wisdom, certainly no divine providence. Nothing, he says instead, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That's the rock bottom foundation of being. And he says in one of his books, Blind Watchmaker, that Darwin now provides the intellectual foundation, satisfying. It allows for atheism to be intellectually satisfying, and this becomes the intellectual foundation of the new atheism that's associated with Dawkins. In a book called The Climbing Mount Improbable, just to develop Dawkins' ideas here, he asks you to imagine, in somewhat ingeniously, it's an interesting image, a mountain on one side of which there's a sheer vertical drop-off to the perpendicular to the plane below. But on the other side, there's the gentle slope at an angle. And he says that life had a biblical span of 6,000 to 10,000 years to move from a primitive status to something as complex as the eye or the brain. Then we would be forgiven if we appealed to the supernatural to explain how something so improbable could take place in such a small amount of time. But let's go to the other side of the mountain and more realistically recognize that light has had roughly 4 billion years to meander back and forth lazily up the side of the mountain, and then mix that meandering over a long period of deep time with the other two ingredients of the Darwinian recipe, lots of accidents or chance plus natural selection, and then you would have a purely natural explanation of how the eye or the brain could come about, because there would be plenty of time to make the improbable more and more probable as time goes along. And that would make, and for Dawkins it does make, theology utterly superfluous. Just to give some other examples, Dawkins is not alone here. And this is just a few examples just pulled out of a hat. David Garrett, an evolutionist who teaches at the University of Washington, says that religious believers, if they take their doctrine seriously, must attribute the intricate design of life directly to an intelligent designer, since only a designer could generate such complex, perfect wonders. But, he says, in fact, biology has taught us the living world is shot through with imperfection. By that he means, above all, that no adaptations are perfect. Would a perfect God make something so imperfect? Unless one wants to attribute either incompetence or sheer malevolence to a designer God, he says, this imperfection, the manifold design flaws of life, points incontrovertibly to a natural, rather than, it's my emphasis, because there's a lot of rather than going on in this debate, points to a natural, rather than a divine process, one in which living things were not created de novo, but evolved. And from that he draws the conclusion, that he's absolutely certain of this, that if Darwin is right, life simply has no possible religious or theological meaning. Just one other example. This is from a Berkeley Press philosopher, Philip Kitcher, one of the best-known philosophers in the English-speaking world, in a very interesting little book called Living with Darwin, agrees with Barish and Dawkins that Darwin destroys the idea of a providential God once and for all. The history of life, he says, dominated by natural selection, is extremely hard to understand in providentialist terms. There's nothing kindly or providential about any of this Darwinian process, and it seems breathtakingly wasteful, that's our word again, and inefficient. Indeed, if we imagine a human observer presiding over a miniaturized version of the whole show, the whole evolutionary show, peering down on his creation, it is extremely hard to equip the face with a kindly expression. So, for him again, and for many people in the intellectual world today, evolution can make no theological sense whatsoever. Intelligent design Christians, such as Philip Johnson, who's probably the chief architect of the so-called intelligent design movement, well, he agrees with these evolutionary materialists, if you want to call them that. Darwinism doesn't, he said, make sense theologically. But Darwinism is wrong. Darwinism is wrong because it doesn't make good scientific sense, let alone theological sense. Even scientifically, you have to wonder how anything purely natural process could have produced the staggering complexity of subcellular mechanisms or brains and other cellular features of life. Natural causes are insufficient. Intelligent design is essential. We need to bring in a non-natural kind of causation to explain how something like life's complexity could ever have come about, even within the 4 billion years that life has had. So he would agree that if Darwin is right, it does destroy, once and for all, the religious meaning of nature. But for him, as for creationists as well, Darwin is simply wrong. So where does this leave us? It leaves us, those of us who want to think about evolution, who take the evidence for evolution seriously, it leaves us with the question, well, how do we deal with this question theologically? And I just want to say that ever since Darwin, there have been many brilliant examples of religious thinkers who have had no difficulty doing this at all, at least in their own minds. I don't have time to go through this whole interesting history of Darwin's religious and theological defenders. Instead, I'm just going to give a sample of different approaches that one might take to this question, and then you can think about these on your own. The first approach, and the one that's least enthusiastic about evolution, but is willing to tolerate it, if not celebrate it, is what we might call the blind faith approach, the fideistic approach. And this approach is taken, at least by a lot of people I know, both in scientific and theological and religious communities. And that's to say, yes, evolutionary biology, science presented, is correct, and we should send our students to schools and have them learn Darwinian theory, and we don't want intelligent design brought in as part of the school curriculum. However, what we refer to, somewhat unthinkingly, they would say, as evolutionary accidents, randomness, contingency, along with the suffering and other things we don't understand about evolution theologically, we should chalk those up to human ignorance. And the thinking here is very modest in a way. It says we humans have to admit, come to grips with the fact that our sense of order or decent design is very, very limited, very, very finite. We're not God. So that whenever anything happens in our experience that doesn't fit into our sense of what should be decent design or order, we refer to it as an accident or an absurdity. We use some similar type of noun or adjective. But this approach argues, and I think you would find agreement with this on the part of many religious traditions. We don't have the perspective that the divine has on things. And perhaps behind Darwin's troubling recipe, there lies a wise and mysterious providential plan that we just shouldn't pry into. We should just admit we've reached an impasse. This is not something we're ever going to get our minds around. So let's just settle for a kind of standoff between evolution and religious faith and theology. And they're happy to cite such lines as you find in the book of Job, after Job has detailed his miseries for many, many pages, and Yahweh, God, appears out of the whirlwind and says to Job, "You know so much. Where were you when I, God, laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." And this blind faith approach appeals to maxims such as God writes straight with crooked lines, or my ways are not your ways. And certainly the evolutionary picture seems to be a very, very crooked line to a lot of religious people. So what do we say about this? My own sense is that whatever theological position you come up with in trying to reconcile Darwin with faith, you have to have at least some degree of modesty in this perspective and accept the fact that any of our theological attempts to understand are tentative. But that's characteristic of theology in general, so this should not be too much of a difficulty. But I'd like to refer to this approach as the default approach. When things get tough, you can always come back to this, I suppose. But I grew up in the Catholic tradition, and Jim Wiseman today referred to St. Anselm's definition of theology as faith seeking understanding. So the Catholic tradition has always encouraged at least tentative experimentation with search for intelligibility of things which seem initially unintelligible. And one such approach that has been very popular in the past, and a lot of people take this today, is what I'll call a pedagogical approach. This approach argues that we can make sense of divine providence and divine wisdom after Darwin if we understand evolution as a curriculum in the school of nature, or in the school of life, if you will. And there are many different versions of this, some of them very sophisticated. The philosopher John Hick has taken this approach. But a more digestible one is given by a science writer named Guy Murchie, who is adherent to the Baha'i tradition. At the same time, he fully accepts evolution. In his delightful book, The Seven Mysteries of Life, he proposes that, yes, Darwinian process is harsh, but it's not evil. And what makes it not evil is that it's educational. The earth is a soul school, or a school for life, more broadly speaking, in which obstacles are essential to life's becoming interesting. I mean, imagine how uninteresting and how unsubstantive life would be now if it never had to face obstacles, including obstacles to survive in the past. So he justifies it, Murchie does, on the basis of pedagogy. Life needs obstacles, and the Darwinian curriculum is as good a set of obstacles as we could possibly imagine. And he says to the reader, what kind of world, if you don't like this, what kind of world would you have created? Imagine, he says, that you are God. And he agrees that this will come more easily to some people than others. Imagine if you were God. What kind of world would you have created? And to make a long story short, his answer is this. Honestly, now, if you were God, could you possibly dream up any more educational, contrasting, thrilling, beautiful, tantalizing world than Earth to develop spirit in? Would you try to make the world nice and safe, or would you let it be provocative, dangerous, and exciting? In actual fact, if it ever came to that, I'm sure you would find it impossible to make a better world, maybe the Darwinian world, than God has already created. So Darwin was right, but divine providence and wisdom actually are not only compatible with evolution, they underlie this curriculum in the school of life. If I were teaching class now, I would pause and ask the students, what do you think of this? I don't have time to do that. some of the questions that come up are these. Is pedagogy really theologically, religiously, or even psychologically the best framework within which to make sense of suffering? The question that arises there is why so much suffering? Wouldn't a lot less suffering be just a pedagogy? And for Darwin, it's especially excess of suffering that bothered him. He could certainly make sense of suffering as an evolutionary adaptation, but why does it have to be so excessive? And in the end, isn't this pedagogical approach rather, underneath it all, anthropocentric? You might want to ask, why do all the other species have to go to school with us? So, it's not, if there is any truth to this, it seems to me it has to be a fragment of a much, much larger truth, if you will. So, just to broaden the picture a bit, and I've been thinking a lot about this over the last several years, I think we might have a third approach, which I'll call a dramatic approach. And this approach begins with the remarkable fact that we take so much for granted, but it really is fantastic, that life, we realize now, has a narrative character. And science has become more and more narrative with geology and biology and now cosmology. And the nature of narrative or story is that throughout human history, it has been primarily through stories that people have grasped a sense of meaning. So story or narrative is really the vehicle, if you will, of any meaning. Think of what gives meaning to your life. Think of all the stories of heroes and others, or ideals that you follow that have shaped your character, and how they come to you primordially in the form of myths, stories, histories, and other narrative meaning. And it occurs to me also, I don't know if this is something I have to think a lot more about, that if design were perfect, as people like Dawkins and Barish and Schweitzer demand that it be, if they're going to accept any idea of God, their disproof of the existence of God is found in the lack of design that they see throughout nature. But if design were perfect from the start, from the outset, would there be any room for a dramatic flow or unfolding of life? If everything were fixed on the first day and finalized perfectly, would that allow for narrative? It certainly would not allow for the incredible diversity we see in the life world, or for dissent, or for maybe meaning itself. Since meaning depends upon there being a narrative unfolded as the context for meaning. So, couldn't we say that design flaws, which are such a scandal to people both in the intelligent design community and their opposite faith among evolutionary naturalists, aren't design flaws, if you will, essential for life's unfolding, and therefore for having, if it has one at all, if it has a dramatic meaning? My point is that the place of intersection, the place of contact between theology and science should not be design, whether design points to deity, but whether the story carries a meaning. And on that line, it's the nature of drama. We have to be cautious about this. It's the nature of any drama, whether you're attending a play or a movie or reading a book, that we have to wait for the meaning to emerge. So if our whole universe and the whole life story are still in process, in fact, for all we know, still just beginning, are we really in a spot to declare with absolute certitude that the universe, therefore, is meaningless, pointless, because of the Darwinian process? I think that the fixation or obsession with design on the part of both the intelligent design people and their opposites, the people like Kitcher and Dawkins, who look for perfect design, is a kind of impatience. It's almost as though it's like a tantrum, like outburst that unless the universe is intelligible to me here and now, in terms of scientific ideas or philosophical ideas, I can't accept it and I reject it. And it's also a sign of a kind of perfectionism, which goes with impatience. We demand that if we're going to read any divine reality or divine presence behind the phenomenon of life, we demand that it be more in the character or in the shape of what we expect in good engineering or architecture. But we don't have that. You see digestive systems, which a modern mechanical engineer could have done a much better job of creating. But we don't have that. Well, why not? Think about that too. What if the universe were from Aloysium, from the beginning, a mechanistic outcome or output, rather than a narrative? Just to develop this point, and repeat a few ideas, I would also suggest that if we're going to have a dramatic approach to this question, we have to link the story of life, which causes so much trouble to so many people, with the larger cosmic drama. And physics, astrophysics, and other sciences are helping us do this in the last 40, 50 years in a way that we never could before. We see the links between physics and life much more clearly. So we should contextualize this whole discussion of evolution now, it seems to me, if we're going to be scientifically sophisticated about it, in the context of a whole cosmos that has been coming into being, in terms of the whole 30-volume history that I showed earlier. Now, evolutionary materialists, such as Kitcher and others, extrapolate from what they see in evolution, the recipe of Darwin made up of accidents, selection, deep time, things which seem to point to purposelessness. They project that back onto the whole cosmos. So the ultimate conclusion they draw, Dawkins himself does this explicitly. We have to draw the conclusion that the whole universe, therefore, is pointless if it sponsors a process like that of biological evolution. But my suggestion here is that we should not ask whether biological design points to deity, as Barish, Kitcher, and Dawkins and the ID people do, but instead ask whether the whole cosmic story carries a meaning. That is not something we can answer directly either. We require, and this is certainly something that makes the biblical tradition consonant with this dramatic approach, it requires patience, waiting. Only those who wait will not be put to shame. Waiting is one of the fundamental virtues of biblical faith. So, to that extent, I see a really tight consonance between the whole posture of piety that the biblical tradition tries to inspire us, namely to accept the fact that promise underlies the whole of reality, makes the whole discussion different from what it was when we just talked about design. So design seems to me to be a dead end in this whole discussion of the relationship of evolution and Darwin to theology. Just to develop that approach, let me talk about another one, just building and piggybacking on the dramatic approach, a more explicitly biblical approach. And this is one that I think in principle, maybe not for a long time, but in principle, all the Abrahamic traditions could see something here. Because they all originate from Abraham. And Abraham is associated forever with the notion of promise. In the stories about Abraham, God comes out of the blue into his life and says, come forth into this new future that I'm offering you. You don't have to pay for it. It's there. So come. And instead of thinking of just Abraham as being called into the future, think of all of nature as seeded with promise, rather than design, rather than perfect design. So that we could think of the biblical God as calling not only Abraham, not only Israel, not only the church, not only the people of God, not only human beings, but calling the whole universe, the whole cosmos, into a new future. And couldn't that theologically be the ultimate explanation of evolution, including Darwinian evolution? We take this for granted, but it has enormous, explosive theological implications which we haven't drawn out. And that's that evolution, along with geology and cosmology, teach us that we live in a universe that's still coming into being. The universe is, from all we know, completely unfinished. And if it's unfinished, it has a future. And if it's unfinished, we should not expect here and now full intelligibility. It's only as the process unfolds that intelligibility emerges. So we live in an intelligibility emerging universe. And once again, let's think therefore not only light, but the whole cosmos as drama rather than design. And that makes the whole Darwinian recipe, which is such a scandal to so many Christians, and also to people like Kitchen and Dawkins, it gives to the Darwinian recipe kind of anticipatory narrative quality that we hadn't noticed before. I mean, any good story is made up of three ingredients: some degree of unpredictability, some degree of coherence or continuity, predictability, and a period of time for the action to unfold. So when you look at Darwin's recipe from a narrative or dramatic point of view, it has accidents, it has regularities, it has consistency, it has laws, predictable, reliable aspect that any good story has to have. Otherwise the story would fall apart into incoherent droplets unless it had some theme of continuity that ties the episodes together. And lots of time. Imagine what the universe would be like if there were no accidents. And even Thomas Aquinas, by the way, in the 13th century, thought that a universe without contingency or accidents would be theologically inconceivable, because the universe would be frozen, fixed, finished, and it would not really be a universe. It would not have the finite autonomy that makes it distinct from its creator. So accidents should not be a problem theologically. The laws of nature, if I had time, I would develop my suggestion that I made recently, that we should think of them kind of analogous to the laws, to the rules of grammar. The rules of grammar in any great piece of literature apply from page 1 to the end. Shakespeare has to follow the rules of grammar. And in a sense, you could say, yes, the rules of grammar generate this particular piece of literature. And the rules of grammar are inviolable. But that doesn't prevent every piece of literature, every piece of creative writing from having an unprecedented novelty that it never had before. This relates to the whole question of whether evolution is completely determined by laws of physics and the law of natural selection. I think we need to change our metaphor from law to rules of grammar, get away from the juridical approach, and adopt a metaphor which is more congenial with the notion of drama, of unfolding narrative. So some degree of lawfulness is necessary whenever you produce any kind of novel. This is true of literature as it is of the universe itself. But what about deep time? Is that something we should be embarrassed about? Or couldn't we say that what we stand on and what has given birth to us and what we find so entrancing now as a result of science, what we stand on is a deep, deep, unfathomable immensity of time for this narrative to unfold. One time, a famous rabbi was asked, why did God create human beings? And the rabbi answered immediately, because God loves stories. Or maybe God loves really big stories. And maybe the intelligibility or the meaning of the story is something we can make conjectures about. But we really have to practice hope, which is enjoined us by the theme of promise and trust. and not try to simply think that we're in a position here and now to declare that the universe is pointless because it sponsors this interesting process of Darwinian evolution. So far, the drama has unfolded in a fascinating way. Life emerged eventually out of accidents and laws of physics and chemistry. Then sentience emerged more recently, then consciousness, and then self-awareness, and then freedom. I haven't talked about freedom, but I have an intuition, I haven't worked it out yet, that any universe that's going to allow for human freedom or anything like that has to be an evolutionary universe. The mechanistic alternative is not going to be a good alternative. And the possibility of hope. Hope is the way in which the universe, now that it has become conscious of itself, opens itself to a new and unprecedented future. So that hope turns out to be, from an epistemological point of view, a most realistic attitude. Hope is the kind of sensitivity that the mind sends out to look for forms or formulations of intelligibility that we never saw before. So hope is not opposed to realism. Hope is the most realistic attitude we could have in an evolutionary universe that's given rise to consciousness and freedom. And try to imagine yourself existing, say, 100 years after the Big Bang, or even 100,000 years after the Big Bang, and you looked out, you were present at the beginning of the universe, and all you saw was first the monotonous sea of plasma, and then later on, the emergence of hydrogen and helium atoms. It would look like a relatively unpromising universe. But out of this unpromising beginning, eventually came light, sentience, consciousness, freedom, hope. And now, if we're truly universe, shouldn't we be looking for something new and unprecedented taking shape up ahead? That's a question asked by Taylor Chardin. I think so. I think this would be the most realistic posture to have. And it's one, moreover, that seems to be psychologically and in every other way to be completely consonant with the biblical understanding of hope and promise. Finally, what would be a specifically Christian theological approach to this question of evolution? Here's some thoughts, just for your own consideration. Other people have other thoughts. When I think of Christianity, when I try to explain it to other people, I say it's a tradition which tells its adherents, in effect, not to think about God without thinking first or simultaneously about the man Jesus. Jesus is pictured in the New Testament as the fullness of the revelation of God. Jesus says to Thomas or to Philip, "He who sees me sees the Father." This is the fundamental idea of Christianity. And if you want to find out what this man is like, well, read the Gospels, of course, but also look at St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, where he brings in an ancient Christian hymn, which had pictured Jesus as being in the form of God, but not clinging to that status. He emptied himself. He underwent a kenosis, a kenesis. He emptied himself and took on the form of a slave. Well, this should be something that should lie at the center of Christian theological reflection upon what the nature of God is. Self-empty. And if any of you think I'm going out on a limb, this is radical theology, here's a quote from Fides et Ratio by Pope John Paul II, who would be a rather moderate, certainly no radical theologian. He says in this encyclical, and I've never seen this before in any other encyclical, the prime commitment of Christian theology is the understanding of God's kenosis. That's what theology should be all about. Is it? If so, it hasn't hit the suburban pulpit. Well, that's fundamental to Christian thought. A grand and mysterious truth he says, for the human mind, which finds it inconceivable that suffering and death can express the love which gives itself and seeks nothing in return. And if you think about what Jim this afternoon referred to as the theology of nature from the point of view of Christianity, Christian theology of nature, as distinct from natural theology, would enter the dialogue of science and faith by recognizing that it's this idea, the idea of a kenotic, self-emptying, an infinite self-emptying love, that Christian theology should place in conversation with science. Don't start with an idea of a designer or a first mover or first cause. Start your theology of science, your theology of nature here with the notion of kenosis. And what do you find? In the light of a kenotic, self-emptying view of deity, what should we expect the world of nature to be like? Shouldn't we expect, as the theologian Jürgen Moltmann has said, and this is an intuition also of the Jewish mystic Simone Weil, that creation is, instead of being divine pyrotechnics, is the consequence of a divine self-humbling, a self-withdrawal, a selflessness, a humility on the part of God, which wants something other than God to fill in the empty space that's left over by the divine self-contraction. It's an idea to think about. I'm not sure many theologians hold this idea, but it's something I think the quotation from John Paul, as well as many other contemporary theologians, would justify. Think of creation as a consequence of a divine self-humbling. And that would mean that we should not expect that there will be any instantaneously perfect design. That would be completely out of character with a God who looks for the otherness of creation. And that means we should expect, rather than be scandalized by the evolutionary wandering around for many, many, many millions and billions of years, for evolutionary experimentation with possibilities, many of which, most of which perhaps don't work. And with the long, long amount of time, deep time, that the process takes, so that those 30 volumes that I put up earlier could turn out in the long run to be only the dawn of this dramatic unfolding. So, in this way of thinking, divine providence and wisdom, which is my fundamental theme here, and whether they're reconcilable with evolution, would manifest themselves in a concern for the independence of creation. And likewise, of course, most important, in the Christian symbol of the cross, we have the belief that God does not watch this process from afar, but takes the world and its matter into the divine self in the doctrine of the incarnation, as expressed in the doctrine of the incarnation, and becomes full participant in the drama of the world's struggle and suffering. Still, obviously, there are lots of questions left, and I don't have time to deal with them now. Maybe someone has some questions about these, but surely the question arises again: why so much suffering? One religious thinker who started thinking about evolution long before many of us, Taylor Chardin, famous Jesuit paleontologist, who was somewhat controversial in his own lifetime, but who, after his death, had an enormous influence on the shape of theology, including the Second Vatican Council, so that if you read Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, you see the imprint of Taylor all over this document. Anyway, Taylor doesn't have any answer to this question either, but he does say we have to keep in mind now what previous generations of theodicy and religious thought about suffering did not have available to them, and that's our very fresh, new awareness that we live in a universe that's still coming into being, which is unfinished. And any process which is still coming into being unfinished, would by definition not be perfect. And if it's not perfect, it has a shadow side. And it's in this shadow side that suffering and evil can gain a foothold, as it were. So, all big questions that bother us, why life struggles, why suffering exists at all, why we have to walk by faith and not by sight. Much of our walk is in darkness. Why religions, as Theo viewed at first hand, are so utterly imperfect. And why hope is essential if we're to be faithful to evolution. Hope is evolution's radar that looks for new possibilities and therefore is completely consistent with evolution and Theo's view. Which leaves us then with an even bigger question. Why would the self-emptying God make an unfinished universe in the first place? Again, this is not an answer, but these are just some thoughts. Theo says an originally perfected creation is theologically inconceivable. And it's for that reason that I've said that the idea of a perfectly designed world is also theologically inconceivable. You imagine a creator on the first day creating a perfect creation, fully rounded off, fully finished. If so, that world, that creation, would not be distinct from God. It would be an appendage of God. It would be an accessory, but it would not have the otherness that biblical traditions all insist that the world has in relation to God. It would be, if you want this, a world completely devoid of suffering and evil. But it would be a world without a future, since everything would have been fixed from the very beginning, deterministically put in its final place from the start. No elbow room, no room to experiment or to become itself. It would be a world without freedom, since once again, everything's determined in a perfect creation to be what it is. And it would be a world without life, since life in life has to have indeterminacy of the future as the horizon within which it transcends the present, and so it becomes new, and it becomes alive. And it would be, this is my main point, it would be a world without drama. And not having drama, which is the meaning of meaning, it would be a world without meaning as well. Well, there's much more, this talk is much more unfinished than the universe. But I'll stop here since I'm running out of time. So thank you very much.
Take the microphone to questions. It's not because of provocation, only proximity. I wonder if the first questions might come from this table.
Yes. John, as a non-believer, but as a very conservative Protestant non-believer, I'm appalled. It seems to me you're driving a horse and cart through so much Christian theology. I mean, you're such a nice, reasonable man. We listen to you, and it sounds so good. But where, for instance, is something, a notion like original sin going to come in with somebody like you? I mean, seriously. I mean, original sin, at least in the Augustinian sense, is something which required an act of sinfulness in a perfect world. And then the whole Christian drama comes, and that's why Jesus had to come to suffer for our salvation. Now, how are you going to, what shall I say, revise or eliminate this fundamental part of Christian theology?
Well, I think, first of all, what I would do is ask why it is that people in theology and religious education in the Christian context talk so much about original sin, and people like Reinhold Niebuhr says it's the only doctrine that you find empirical evidence for. But why have we emphasized it? We've emphasized it for Christological reasons, to make the figure of the Savior more significant. rather than just something that just happened to come along. From the very beginning, Christians experienced Christ, both in his life and afterwards, as a font of healing, of reconciliation, of bringing together that which had been split apart. So in Western Christianity, much more incidentally than in Eastern Christianity, especially after Augustine, we've used the doctrine of original sin to try to show how momentous a thing it is that a Savior came along and saved us from original sin. What we can do after Darwin, those of us, including myself, who can't take the story of Adam and Eve as though it's scientifically, historically literal, we want to look for what the serious meaning is in that story. And I think what the story tells us, and you find this parallels in other traditions too, stories of origins, are in a sense telling us that the world is not what it was intended to be. But we don't have to necessarily theologically place that ideal that we're after in some chronologically, calendarically past moment in time. But we can do what Genesis itself was struggling already to do, and that's to point to something promised for the future. Eschatology is more important in Christian biblical faith than protology talks about the origin. So, I would say talking about the garden and so forth was a very, very sophisticated way prior to our understanding of evolution and the way science has presented the story of life, of pointing out to us we need healing. The world is messed up. And if we interpret the world from the point of view of evolution, we actually make a flaw that needs to be healed much more dramatic and momentous than the flaw as it's presented in the mythical language of the Bible. The whole universe, being unfinished, needs new creation. And when you get to St. Paul, when you talk about how he understood the significance of Christ, it was in terms of new creation. So we need to actually widen the wound, in a sense, as a result of evolution. So as Teilhard points out quite beautifully, and I completely agree with this, so as to magnify the person of Christ, the person of the center of the center in a purely human story of what's going wrong with the universe. The universe is still coming into being, and no other kind of universe is possible. The universe created whole and perfect on the first day. So the best we could do in terms of trying to express the significance of Christ. Christ restored the garden in sense. So much Christianity has been motivated more by nostalgia than by hope. The sweet decay of nostalgia has a deep foothold in Christian faith. And what evolution does for me, it allows Christian faith to blossom into hope much more radically than any other thing that we've encountered before. At least that's how I remember. There's a lot more to be said, and that's an excellent question. And this is by no means fully thought out, but here's some thoughts on that.
Dr. Watt, I'd like to ask about Theodore Chardin. We were talking about him before the dinner with some of the other people, and I've been told that he is passé. I'm glad to hear that you say that he has a great place in the evolutionary concept. In the 1950s, he was highly respected by the scientific world, and Julian Huxley introduced his phenomenon of man in highly complimentary terms. It seemed almost as if he was endorsing his principles. But the Jesuits, of course, rejected him completely. They allowed his publication to be published, and it was done out there without the blessing of the Society of Jesus. But what I'm asking now really is there a possibility of resurrecting Theodore Chardin? seems to me, from what you've been saying the last 15 or 20 minutes, that he was doing exactly that, trying to reconcile the scientific world with the theological world in a way that could be acceptable to genuine Christianity. I think what he was trying to do is that evolution is coming in a spiritual way, rather. And the continuity, and I don't know whether you know this, Human Destiny in America, it was the biggest bestseller of the 1950s. And the underpinning of that really was Teilhard de Chardin's work. And it seems to me that this could be the kind of thing that could be developed. Is that possible? And is there a future for the work of philosophy of Teilhard de Chardin?
Well, I can give you many thoughts on this. The continuity didn't have much influence on Teilhard because the continuity was more toward the intelligent design people who are resurrecting the continuity, and they're not resurrecting the Teilhard. But anyway, Teilhard was, for those of you who are not familiar, was a famous Jesuit geologist and paleontologist who started writing papers on how to reconcile evolution, science in general, and evolution with Christian faith. When he was still a very young man, his Jesuit superiors got hold of some of these essays which were circulating in mimeograph form, and they thought that they'd better get Teilhard out of the European theater, so they sent him to China, which is the wrong place to send people who like to dig up old bones, because he was involved in the discovery of so-called Peking man, actually a woman. And he became one of the top 2 or 3 geologists of the Asian continent. Almost all those who have studied the history of geology will agree with that. So scientifically, he was impeccable and sterling and deserved a great reputation there. But he started writing The Phenomenon of Man and Divine Review and others, his major works, and he could not get them published in his own lifetime. So he died in 1955 on Easter Sunday, but almost immediately his lay friends got the manuscripts and started flooding the presses. Harper and Row, the #1 bestseller of the 20th century in the field of religion was Teilhard's Phenomenon of Man. So almost all the experts who advised the bishops at the Second Vatican Council, which started in 1962, which was the same year that the Holy Office sent a manicum or a warning to all Catholic universities and seminaries, don't let your students read this stuff, it's dangerous. But by 1965, by the end of the council, you see the imprint of Teilhard all over the place, especially in Galileo's best. So he got his revenge, really, but only after his death. And incidentally, the Jesuits did not all reject him. They got a lot of support from the Jesuit community. So just stick to it. You're eventually going to succeed. Henri de Lubac has written 3 books developing his thesis that Teilhard's thought is completely orthodox. Paul VI said that Teilhard, by the end of the councils, Teilhard is absolutely necessary. Even John Paul II and Benedict have spoken of Teilhard very, very favorably. So why, the question, why the neglect? And to make a long story short, it seems to me that the same forces which want us to forget about Vatican II want us to forget about Teilhard de Chardin. Evolution, after all, implies change. And for a lot of people, that is a very, very difficult concept to absorb into Catholicism and other Christian faiths. And it has to be done very carefully. But Teilhard, in my opinion, has a kind of thought that will help us integrate the universe into our faith. And that is what we need to do if we take seriously the doctrine of the Incarnation. A lot of other things need to be said, but hopefully we'll bring it back.
Matthew,
I'll tell you, you're talking about drama. I recently read a book called The Boy. It is based on a picture of Nazi soldiers guarding with guns as a group of children with their hands up, the boy, first of all, are let out. Now, if I were to stop them in history and say, well done, people, this is a great problem, and we're part of this problem. And these nasty men who would send you to Auschwitz to deal with that are all part of a great problem. I say that's not very helpful. And I say, if you had said that to those children and their mothers at that time, you would have been a very cruel man saying something really unacceptable. And I think that is the basic problem of this whole thing. Teilhard, if I remember correctly, in the First World War, he saw it as a cleansing. He saw it as an evolutionary moment. Adolf Hitler saw evolution at work in his own time, in his own party. He would not interfere with men who argue with one another because evolutionary triumph of the best would triumph. So there are problems that I find have not been addressed. Thank you.
Well, at one time I tried to defend myself against the charge of cruelty. That's a point that's been brought up so many times. But if Teilhard were here, he would have a very simple answer to that. The more human beings encounter the fact of evil and suffering and death, the more in need they are of a message of hope. And if that's not a Christian idea, I don't know what is. He was not in any way justifying evil. He was trying to find some way that we could readjust after the crisis, the suffering, and meaninglessness, and emptiness, and the void of the war and the killing fields and so forth. My wife and I have been reading lots of this literature lately about that, what two men did, Stalin and Hitler. I don't see anything in Teilhard that justifies what they did, or legitimates it, or condones it in any way. Or because the fundamental message was that in spite of evil, we must believe, we must hope.
But maybe, but my impression was, from my reading back in the 60s, was that this was another bland approach to a very serious problem.
Well, nobody ever said any religious thinker had it. And he himself admits he doesn't have a full answer to the problem of suffering. But is there anything wrong about his saying, well, now that we know that the universe is unfinished, that the whole problem of suffering looks different. It's not alleviated, but it looks different from the idea that we had for centuries, that God created a perfect universe, and we messed it up, and now we have to spend our lives in bits of expiation. I don't have time to go into it now, but the whole vision of answering the problem of suffering by way of expiation can be rethought if we interpret life in terms of evolution. And a lot of us think that the myth of expiation is over, and not just us today. That's the message of the letter to the Hebrews. The age of expiation is over. And in my own experience, nothing has brought that home or provided a context for driving that Christian message home. The age of expiation is over. Then this beautiful new evolutionary portrait of the universe. I don't have time to go into detail, but Taylor himself saw that.
I'm going to rely on your last slide about a perfect universe. I think we've got something of a false dichotomy here. In other words, either the universe is perfect and sterile and boring and static and stuck in amber, or it is the world of Nazis and tsunamis and terror and horrors. In other words, it seems to me that God did in fact create a universe that was not despoiled by sin, but which had, like an infant, had the promise of maturation and increased unity with its creator over time. And that to suggest that the world has to be beset by sin and death in order to move toward something that is dramatic and has a they would say that, you know, human intellect and knowledge and energy will all move toward a wonderful, bright new future. But you can move toward a wonderful, bright new future completely without God if you want to.
You're talking about optimism, not hope. And there's a big difference. And I have a book that I would recommend that you read. I can't go into it now. It's by Jürgen Moltmann, who was discovering the future about a few years after Teilhard de Chardin was, theology of hope. And he's not alone. Many Catholics, and I think including Joseph Ratzinger, who recently wrote an encyclical on hope, would find that that virtue is absolutely central to Christian faith. And all of them distinguish it from naive optimism, or from some idea of economic or technological progress. And so did Teilhard. Teilhard is characterized so much as being sort of a Spencerian, a prophet of optimism. But he was trying to communicate hope to a hopeless world. And what's wrong with that?
Two more questions, and then we'll move across to the afterward.
I appreciate your demonstration that Christian theology is compatible with Darwinian evolutionary theories, as far as it goes. But as far as your portrait of evolutionary narrative, from inert matter to life, to human life, to consciousness, with all humility and sincerity, can you please explain to me the scientific process or mechanism through which a single living cell emerges from inert matter, or how human consciousness, subjective experience, arises from the little gray cells? And if you can't give me a scientific explanation for that, is this not just a myth designed to appeal to materialists?
Well, first of all, I distinguish between science and materialism. It's a big mistake to think that everybody who writes a scientific theory is by definition a materialist, metaphysically, and so forth. There are a number of different ways in which metaphysically you can contextualize what science has discovered. The most popular and prominent way in the Western world is that of scientific naturalism, which maintains that now that we have natural explanations for life and so forth, that we don't need any theological explanations. But not all naturalists are materialists. And the problem that you're talking about is sometimes called, in cognitive science, is sometimes called the hard problem. And many good cognitive scientists admit we still have not drawn the bridge between the inner world of subjectivity, the withinness of our experience, and the objective portrait of physical chemical processes that subjective experience depends upon. But what's happening, what this cosmic story does, that we weren't able to do before, is to show that the existence of life and mind in this Big Bang universe is much more tightly tied in to the character of physical reality than the modern materialism that prevailed until recently and still prevails in some of the life sciences and social sciences tell you. So that we can't draw that dualistic line. You're in a sense, in your question, you're assuming a kind of dualistic worldview, where matter is over here and mind is over here, therefore matter is fundamentally mindless. Well, even in contemporary philosophy, and especially in contemporary science, we can no longer say, I don't think, that the universe was ever essentially mindless. And it's the narrative character of the universe that allows us to see one big story that starts with electrons, protons, and quarks, and so forth, and eventually leads to brains, and which is probably going to lead in the future, if we're sensitive to what might be taking shape up ahead, to something more momentous. Why should we assume that we've suddenly come to an end of this process?
No, I'm just assuming that for something to be accepted as true, it has to be scientifically demonstrated. And if I understand you correctly, that material can have mind. You say this chair has mind?
just a few words. Science, by definition, has to leave out certain considerations. Science, starting with the beginning of the modern world, said we're not going to talk about God, we're not going to talk about values, meaning, and we're not going to talk about subjectivity. We're going to see what we can find out about the world by looking at it in terms of efficient material cost. And we found out an awful lot. It's been a very, very fruitful thing. But to say that science is the only way to read the universe is not science, it's a belief. And it's a belief that I reject, and I think you do too.
All right, we'll give the last question to Dr. James.
Before I ask the question, John, I'd like to thank you, not simply for the clear presentation you made tonight, but for being a generous person. People here may not know it. You not only readily give talks at large conferences like this, you've not only come to speak to some of my university students at Catholic U, whether or not you remember it, some years ago you came to our Abbey High School.
I just remember the small other area, but
that was a hardship.
Portsmouth Abbey will not be making up the difference.
But anyway, I'd like to just ask a question about a couple of the approaches you mentioned here tonight. One of the early ones was human ignorance, and you certainly didn't totally reject it, but you said that it has to be understood perhaps in a larger context, that it's incomplete. And then towards the end, you spoke, of course, of what you call a biblical approach with nature as promise and life as drama. And I do understand you weren't at all equating the two, but would you not be able perhaps to say that they're in the same ballpark? Because at least also the biblical approach does include a factor of human ignorance. We don't know how the story ends.
yes, and I think that Job, in a way, supports my idea that we should not think that just because we accumulated expertise in science or theology, that we are in a position to say what it's all about. And that's why I said that the first position, the blind faith position, even though I think we can go beyond that and try other things, we always have to come back to the smallness of our perspective on things. And these are all tentative suggestions. It's part of what you call faith-seeking understanding. Seeking, not necessarily finding.
Thank you.